Some individual cities in Missouri and Colorado now issuing gay marriage licenses in defiance of votes that their state's populations have taken. This after a federal appeals court struck down Utah's ban on gay marriage, but Utah officials plan to appeal to the Supreme Court. A federal judge also striking down Indiana's ban, and that is being appealed. So with so many cases pending in so many states, how is this issue going to be resolved? Here with some thoughts on that, Dan Schorr, a former prosecutor. Heather Hansen is a trial attorney. The Supreme Court has weighed in on a couple of different gay marriage decisions over the years, but this issue, I mean, we've got this patchwork of states. Some allow it, some don't. Those that don't recognize it from other states. Isn't that something that the Supreme Court, Heather, is going to have to decide?
I think they chose a year ago not to decide it. In the Hollingsworth case, which was decided the same day as the DOMA case, they said it's up to the states. And
DOMA, Defense of Marriage Act.
That's correct. The states have, bit by bit, decided that most of these laws banning gay marriage are unconstitutional. And I think that's what the Supreme Court intended.
But the Supreme Court is also has to be sensitive to states' rights, isn't it? And it's one thing for Massachusetts, which got this whole ball of wax, rolling 10 or 12 years ago. It's one thing for them to pass it, where a state like, I don't know, Georgia or Mississippi might not be so keen on it.
Right, and the Supreme Court clearly is not in a rush to deal with it, but I think they're going to have to eventually, because so many courts are making decisions on this issue. Federal courts are striking down laws that ban same-sex marriage. Ultimately, the Supreme Court's going to have to weigh in on this.
But
I don't know if they are, though, John, because all of the courts are in agreement. None of the federal courts have said, no, these bans on gay marriage are constitutional and they are allowed. So there's no controversy for the Supreme Court to decide. I think they wanted state by state the federal courts to make the decisions so that they weren't the ones making the decisions in some way in deference to the states themselves.
But what about, for instance, in Missouri, the population, they took a vote and they said, the voters said we don't want gay marriage here, but then in comes a federal judge who says, sorry.
Well, there's two separate issues. One is, does the legislature and the governor of each state want to legalize same-sex marriage? New York, through the political process, legalized same-sex marriage. But these federal cases are deciding whether or not there's a constitutional right to same-sex marriage. And because you've seen federal courts say that there is, the Supreme Court is going to have to weigh in and say whether that's the right legal decision or whether that's wrong, because there's already now precedent among local federal courts saying that that same-sex marriage should be legalized.
But again, if there has been some kind of a public referendum in a certain state and the public has, by whatever margin, voted it down.
Well, and that's the problem here, John, because you are correct. The legislature should have some ability to make law and not just have the judiciary come in and overthrow them every time. But that's what's happening, and I think it's what's going to continue to happen. When that case was decided a year ago, Scalia wrote a dissent on it with this exact issue in mind, with the concern for the fact that voters in various states were ultimately just going to not have a say.
Yeah, and I thought about this when Massachusetts passed its law,
right,
way back when. What happens if somebody gets married in Massachusetts and then moves to Utah or Montana or something?
The issue here, though,
are they still married?
Voters can't ban same-sex marriage if there's a constitutional right to same-sex marriage, and federal courts are starting to say that there is this right. The Supreme Court hasn't weighed in yet, but they're going to have to, because you're already seeing federal courts address this issue. Can voters ban same-sex marriage? The tide of public opinion is saying that they can't, and that same-sex marriage should be legalized. The Supreme Court's going to weigh in eventually, I think.
All right, we'll continue to keep an eye on it. It's kind of a confusing issue right now because the states that allowed it are getting thrown out, like Utah, for instance.
It's confusing.
Yeah, it is right now. Maybe the Supreme Court will weigh in. Dan Schorr, Heather Hansen, thank you both.
Thanks,
Thank you.